Nobody pays real money for trash. The laughter rolled across the Saturday market like a gust of wind, drawing smiles from nearby vendors and curious glances from passing shoppers. A man in an expensive golf shirt pointed toward a folding table covered with old metal parts, worn tools, dusty electronics, and strange mechanical pieces. "I mean, seriously," he continued. "Who buys this stuff?" More laughter followed. Standing behind the table, Ethan Carter simply smiled. He had heard comments like that for years. Some people saw junk. Some people saw clutter. Some people saw failure. Ethan had learned long ago that value and appearance were rarely the same thing. He adjusted a cardboard box filled with old machine components and greeted a customer walking past. "Good morning." The customer smiled politely and continued down the row of booths. The market occupied a large open lot near the edge of town. Every Saturday, vendors arrived before sunrise. Farmers sold produce. Artists displayed handmade crafts. Collectors searched for antiques. Families wandered between rows of tables enjoying the warm weather and local atmosphere. And every weekend, Ethan arrived with things most people ignored: discarded equipment, broken gadgets, forgotten tools, parts rescued from storage units, estate sales, auctions, and abandoned workshops. To many people, it looked like trash. To Ethan, it looked like possibility. A young girl stepped beside him carrying 2 cups of lemonade. "Dad, you should have heard them earlier." Lily Carter handed him a cup. "One guy asked if we were running a recycling center." Ethan laughed softly. "Maybe we are." Lily rolled her eyes dramatically. "You always say that." "Because it is true." She smiled despite herself. At 10 years old, Lily understood her father better than most adults did. She knew that behind every strange item on the table was a story. She knew he spent evenings researching old equipment and studying manufacturing designs. She knew he could identify valuable pieces hidden inside piles of forgotten objects. Most importantly, she knew he never let rude comments bother him. Across the aisle, another vendor shook his head while looking toward Ethan's booth. "I still do not understand how you make a living doing this." Ethan smiled. "Neither do some of my customers." The vendor laughed. "Fair enough." The morning crowd continued growing. Families strolled between booths. Children carried bags of kettle corn. Music drifted from a nearby stage where local performers entertained visitors. The atmosphere felt relaxed and cheerful. Yet every so often, someone would stop at Ethan's table and smirk. Some laughed openly. Others whispered comments to friends. One teenager pointed toward an old metal case and asked, "Does that thing belong in a museum?" Ethan smiled. "Maybe." The teenager laughed and walked away. Lily looked frustrated. "People are annoying." Ethan took a sip of lemonade. "Sometimes. Does it not bother you?" He glanced around the crowded market. Then he looked at his daughter. "You know what bothers me?" Lily shook her head. "People throwing away things they do not understand." She smiled immediately. That sounded exactly like him. Around noon, the market reached its busiest point. Customers filled every row. Vendors negotiated prices. Conversations blended into a steady hum of activity. Then something unusual happened. An elderly auction manager Ethan knew approached carrying a medium-sized wooden crate. The man looked tired. "Ethan, good to see you, Frank." Frank lowered the crate beside the table. "Got something you might want." Ethan examined the weathered wood carefully. There were faded markings on one side, partially hidden beneath scratches and dust. "Where did this come from?" Frank shrugged. "Storage liquidation." Ethan crouched beside the crate. Something immediately caught his attention. Not the box itself, the way it had been reinforced. The unusual hardware. The manufacturing details. Tiny clues invisible to most people. Lily noticed the change in his expression. "Dad." Ethan smiled slightly. "Interesting." Frank laughed. "That is exactly why I brought it here." Nearby, one of the men who had mocked Ethan earlier looked over and smirked. "What now?" he asked loudly. "More garbage." Several people laughed again. Ethan ignored them. His attention remained fixed on the crate. Because while everyone else saw another worthless box filled with junk, he had just noticed something that made his pulse quicken. Hidden beneath years of dust was a small, faded symbol. A symbol he recognized immediately. And in that single moment, standing in the middle of a crowded market full of laughter, Ethan realized that whatever was inside this forgotten crate might be worth far more than anyone could imagine. The laughter from the market slowly faded as the afternoon sun drifted lower across the open lot. but Ethan Carter barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on the wooden crate sitting beside his table. Customers continued walking past. Vendors continued calling out prices. Children continued chasing one another between booths. Yet for Ethan, the entire world seemed to narrow around a single faded symbol hidden beneath decades of dust. Lily crouched beside him. "What is it?" she whispered. Ethan ran a finger carefully across the marking. "I am not completely sure." Lily smiled. "That means you are excited." Ethan laughed softly. "Maybe a little." Frank crossed his arms and watched. "You recognized something, did you not?" Ethan nodded slowly. "I think this crate belonged to an old industrial research company." Frank raised an eyebrow. "The one from Chicago?" Ethan looked surprised. "You know about them?" "My grandfather worked there for a few years." Ethan glanced back at the symbol. His curiosity grew even stronger. The company had disappeared decades earlier after developing experimental manufacturing systems far ahead of their time. Most people had forgotten it ever existed. Yet collectors occasionally spoke about prototypes, documents, and engineering concepts that surfaced unexpectedly at auctions. Some discoveries proved worthless. Others changed lives. Across the aisle, the man who had mocked Ethan earlier noticed the growing attention around the crate. "Please do not tell me people are getting excited about a wooden box." Several vendors laughed. Ethan smiled politely and continued examining the crate. He had no interest in arguing. He never did. Years of buying discarded equipment taught him something valuable. The loudest people in the room were rarely the ones who noticed important details. By late afternoon, the market began slowing down. Families packed purchases into vehicles. Vendors started organizing inventory. Long shadows stretched across the pavement. Ethan finally purchased the crate from Frank for a modest amount and carefully loaded it into the back of his pickup truck. The man who had mocked him shook his head. "You paid actual money for that?" Ethan smiled. "I did." "Why?" Ethan looked toward the crate. "Because sometimes people throw away things they do not understand." The man laughed again. Ethan simply closed the truck bed and moved on. An hour later, father and daughter were driving home along a quiet county road. Golden sunlight illuminated fields stretching toward the horizon. Lily sat staring at the crate through the rear window. "Do you really think there is something important inside?" Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "Maybe. Like treasure." He laughed. "Not pirate treasure. That is disappointing. Engineering treasure." Lily grinned. "That sounds exactly like something you would say." Their home sat on a few peaceful acres outside town. A modest white house stood beside a large workshop where Ethan spent most evenings repairing equipment, restoring machinery, and researching unusual finds. The workshop was not fancy. The concrete floor showed years of use. Shelves overflowed with tools and parts. Workbenches carried scratches earned through decades of honest labor. Yet to Ethan, it felt perfect. After dinner, he and Lily carried the crate inside. Dust floated through shafts of light cast by overhead fixtures. The atmosphere felt almost ceremonial. Lily folded her arms dramatically. Moment of truth. Ethan smiled. Moment of curiosity. He carefully removed several rusted fasteners. The wood creaked softly. Then the lid finally lifted. Both stared inside. For several seconds, neither spoke. There was no gold, no cash, no dazzling treasure. Instead, the crate contained folders, technical drawings, notebooks, and several unusual mechanical components wrapped in aging protective material. Lily blinked. "Paper." Ethan leaned closer. His heartbeat quickened. Not just paper. He carefully lifted one of the folders. Inside were engineering sketches unlike anything he had expected to find. Detailed, precise, remarkably advanced. He opened another, then another. Every page revealed concepts decades ahead of their era. Lily watched his expression change. "Dad." Ethan slowly sat down at the workbench. "This is incredible." "What is it?" He turned several pages carefully. "Research. Old research. Very old." Lily looked confused. Ethan smiled. Sometimes ideas arrive before the world is ready for them. The evening stretched into night. Hours passed without either noticing. Ethan studied diagrams while making notes. Every document raised new questions. Every page revealed connections to technologies now worth enormous amounts of money. Most astonishing of all, many concepts had never been publicly released. Around midnight, Ethan finally leaned back in his chair. The workshop sat completely silent except for the faint ticking of a wall clock. Lily had fallen asleep nearby. Ethan looked across the scattered papers covering the workbench. Then he looked toward the crate. For years, people laughed when he bought forgotten things. They called them junk, trash, waste. But sitting before him now was proof of something he had always believed. Value does not disappear simply because the world fails to recognize it. And as he carefully examined one final document hidden beneath the others, Ethan discovered a name connected to the research. A name that would soon attract the attention of one of the most powerful CEOs in the country. The name appeared near the bottom of a yellowed research document, almost hidden among technical references and patent notes. Ethan Carter stared at it for several seconds. Then he read it again to make sure he was not mistaken. The name belonged to a company that now sat at the center of one of the fastest-growing industries in America. More surprisingly, the company had recently become famous for investing billions of dollars into advanced recycling technology, sustainable manufacturing, and industrial innovation. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. The workshop felt unusually quiet. Outside, the night wind moved gently through the trees surrounding the property. Inside, stacks of documents covered nearly every available surface. Lily stirred awake from the small couch in the corner and rubbed her eyes. "Did you find something?" Ethan looked toward her. "Maybe." Lily smiled sleepily. "That means yes." Ethan laughed softly. "You know me too well." He carefully handed her one of the folders. "Look at the dates." Lily examined the paperwork. "These are really old. Almost 40 years old. Why does that matter?" Ethan pointed towards several diagrams. "Because some of these ideas are being used today." Lily looked confused. Ethan smiled patiently. Imagine someone drawing plans for a smartphone before most people even owned a computer. Her eyes widened. That would be crazy. Exactly. Lily stared at the pages with new appreciation. The following morning, Ethan woke before sunrise. Instead of heading directly to the market or searching for more inventory, he sat at the kitchen table reviewing documents while drinking coffee. The deeper he looked, the more remarkable the discovery became. Several concepts described manufacturing processes that closely resembled modern technologies. Others contained improvements never publicly documented. Most importantly, the papers appeared authentic. This was not a collection of random notes. It was a missing piece of industrial history. By mid-morning, Ethan made a decision. He needed answers. Not publicity. Not attention. Answers. He began contacting industry historians, retired engineers, and technical archivists. Most conversations followed a similar pattern. "You found what?" one expert asked. Ethan explained. Silence followed. Then curiosity. Another researcher requested photographs immediately. A retired engineer spent nearly an hour discussing details over the phone. Each conversation strengthened Ethan's belief that the discovery might be far more significant than he initially imagined. Yet not everyone reacted positively. Later that afternoon, Ethan returned to the Saturday market to pick up several items left in storage. News of his unusual crate had already started circulating among vendors. The same man who mocked him previously spotted Ethan unloading boxes. "How is the treasure hunt going?" he asked with a grin. Several nearby vendors laughed. Ethan smiled politely. "Pretty well. Find any hidden millions yet?" More laughter followed. Ethan simply continued loading equipment. He had learned something important over the years. People often laughed when they lacked information. It was easier than admitting uncertainty. Across the country, meanwhile, Charlotte Bennett sat inside a sleek conference room overlooking downtown Seattle. As CEO of Green Core Innovations, her schedule rarely allowed moments of quiet reflection. Meetings filled every hour. Reports covered every desk. Investors expected constant updates. Yet one subject had recently captured her attention: historical research related to early industrial sustainability projects. Green Core had spent years searching for lost archives connected to pioneering environmental technologies. Several promising leads had ended in disappointment. Missing records, incomplete patents, lost documentation. Then an email arrived from one of the researchers Ethan contacted. Charlotte opened the message absent-mindedly while preparing for another meeting. Seconds later, her attention sharpened completely. Attached photographs displayed several pages from Ethan's discovery. Charlotte zoomed in. Then again, her expression changed. The room around her seemed to disappear. One executive noticed immediately. Everything okay? Charlotte continued reading. Cancel my next meeting. The executive blinked. What? Charlotte looked up. Cancel it. Why? She pointed toward the screen. Because if these documents are real, someone just found something we have been searching for over 6 years. Back in the small town market, Ethan finished loading the last box into his pickup truck. He remained completely unaware of the conversations now taking place hundreds of miles away. For him, the day felt ordinary. The sky remained blue. The market remained busy. Lily continued helping customers. Life moved forward as usual, yet invisible connections were already forming. Researchers were making calls. Executives were asking questions. Experts were examining photographs. And one of the most influential CEOs in the industry had just become very interested in a discovery made by a single father whom most people still believed was simply selling trash. As Ethan closed the tailgate of his truck, his phone vibrated. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. He answered casually. What he heard next would begin changing everything. The unfamiliar voice on the phone sounded professional, calm, and surprisingly direct. Ethan Carter stood beside his pickup truck while the Saturday market continued buzzing around him. Vendors negotiated prices. Children laughed nearby. Someone played guitar near the food stalls. Yet the words coming through the phone instantly captured his full attention. Mr. Carter, my name is Rebecca Lawson. I am calling on behalf of Green Core Innovations. Ethan glanced toward Lily, who was helping organize several boxes. How can I help you? A brief pause followed. We have reviewed some of the research documents you recently shared with industry historians. Ethan leaned against the truck. I see. Our executive team would like to discuss them with you. Ethan smiled slightly. Over the years, he had learned that people became much more interested once they realized something might be valuable. Discuss what exactly? Rebecca sounded careful. Their significance. Ethan looked toward the horizon, where afternoon sunlight painted the sky with shades of gold. And who is interested? Another pause. Our CEO. For the first time during the conversation, Ethan appeared genuinely surprised. After the call ended, Lily immediately walked over. Who was that? Ethan placed the phone in his pocket. A company. What kind of company? A very large one. Lily's eyes widened. Good large or bad large? Ethan laughed softly. I suppose we will find out. By Monday morning, emails began arriving from researchers across the country. Some requested additional photographs. Others asked technical questions. Several offered opinions regarding the document's historical importance. The responses varied, but one theme remained consistent. Nobody could believe the collection existed. One retired engineer wrote a message that Ethan read 3 separate times. If these materials are authentic, they represent one of the most important missing industrial archives discovered in decades. Ethan sat quietly after reading those words. Not because he was thinking about money. Not because he was imagining headlines. He was thinking about the wooden crate sitting in his workshop. The crate everyone called junk. The crate people laughed at only days earlier. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Seattle, Charlotte Bennett sat inside a conference room surrounded by senior executives and technical advisors. Large displays covered the walls. Digital copies of Ethan's documents appeared on multiple screens. Every person in the room understood the potential significance of what they were seeing. One advisor pointed toward a diagram. This concept predates current industry standards by nearly 20 years. Another shook his head. Nobody thought these records survived. Charlotte listened carefully. She had spent years pursuing sustainable manufacturing breakthroughs. Her company invested enormous resources into innovation. Yet several of the concepts described in the documents solved problems that modern researchers still struggled to address. How certain are we? She asked. A historian answered immediately. The documents appear authentic. Another specialist nodded. Very authentic. Charlotte folded her hands thoughtfully. And the man who found them? Several executives exchanged glances. One opened a file. Single father. Small town. Buys and sells discarded equipment. No advanced academic credentials. Charlotte looked up, and yet he recognized what experts overlooked. Silence followed. Nobody disagreed. Later that week, Ethan received invitations from multiple organizations requesting meetings. Some were polite. Others sounded urgent. A few included impressive financial offers simply for exclusive access to the documents. Ethan declined them all, not because the offers lacked value, because he still did not fully understand what he possessed. Lily watched him sorting through emails one evening. "You keep saying no." Ethan smiled. "Sometimes yes is easy. And the right answer takes longer." Lily considered that, then nodded. She was becoming accustomed to her father's unusual wisdom. The following Saturday, Ethan returned to the market as usual. The same folding tables, the same pickup truck, the same collection of tools and equipment. Yet something had changed. People were paying attention now. News traveled quickly in small towns. Several vendors approached, asking questions. Curious shoppers stopped by his booth. Even the man who previously mocked him appeared unusually polite. "Heard you found something valuable." Ethan smiled. "Maybe." The man laughed nervously. "Looks like you knew what you were doing after all." Ethan simply nodded. There was no satisfaction in proving someone wrong, only quiet acceptance. Across the market, Frank watched the exchange and smiled to himself. The crowd that once laughed now seemed eager to learn more. Human nature rarely changed. As the afternoon progressed, another phone call arrived. This time the number displayed a Seattle area code. Ethan stepped away from the booth and answered. The voice on the other end sounded confident, intelligent, and remarkably composed. "Mr. Carter?" "Yes." "This is Charlotte Bennett." Ethan recognized the name immediately. So did nearly everyone in American manufacturing. "Good afternoon." Charlotte smiled on the other end of the line. "I believe we need to talk." Ethan glanced toward the busy market, the folding tables, and the people still browsing what many considered junk. Then he looked toward the old wooden crate resting safely in his truck. Something told him this conversation would become the beginning of a much larger story. Charlotte Bennett's voice carried the calm confidence of someone accustomed to making important decisions. Yet beneath that confidence, Ethan Carter detected genuine curiosity. She was not calling to impress him. She was calling because she wanted answers. "I appreciate you taking my call," Charlotte said. Ethan stood beside his truck while the market slowly settled into the rhythm of a late Saturday afternoon. "Of course. I have spent the last 3 days reviewing copies of the materials you discovered." Ethan nodded, even though she could not see him. And a brief silence followed. Then Charlotte answered honestly. "I think they may be worth more than anyone realizes." Ethan glanced toward Lily, who was helping an elderly customer carry a small toolbox to a nearby vehicle. She always looked for ways to help people. He smiled. "Several researchers have said something similar. Researchers are being cautious." Charlotte paused. "I am not." That answer caught his attention. The conversation continued for nearly 40 minutes. They discussed manufacturing history, patent records, sustainability technologies, industrial design concepts. To Charlotte's surprise, Ethan spoke with remarkable knowledge and understanding. He never exaggerated, never tried to sound impressive. He simply shared observations. The more Charlotte listened, the more intrigued she became. Finally, she asked a question. "Would you be willing to meet?" Ethan considered it carefully. "Maybe." Charlotte laughed softly. "That sounds like a cautious answer." "It is." "Fair enough." Ethan smiled. "I have responsibilities here." "Your daughter?" Ethan paused. "How did you know?" "People told me about her." Ethan looked toward Lily again. She was laughing with the elderly customer now. "She comes first." Charlotte respected that answer immediately. "Then I will come to you." Several days later, a black SUV quietly rolled into the small town. No cameras followed. No reporters arrived. No publicity team accompanied the visit. Charlotte had deliberately kept the trip private. She wanted to see the documents for herself before making any public statements. More importantly, she wanted to meet the man who found them. The vehicle stopped near Ethan's workshop just after lunch. Charlotte stepped out and looked around. The property was simple, clean, honest. A modest house stood beside a large workshop. Tools were neatly organized. Vehicles waited for repair. The place reflected care rather than wealth. Ethan greeted her at the door. "Welcome." Charlotte smiled. "Thank you." Their handshake felt surprisingly natural. No tension, no pretense, just mutual respect. Inside the workshop, sunlight streamed through high windows. Workbenches held engines, tools, and carefully organized parts. Nearby shelves displayed unusual items Ethan had collected over the years. Charlotte noticed something immediately. Everything had a purpose. Nothing felt random. Lily entered carrying 2 bottles of water. "Hi." Charlotte smiled warmly. "You must be Lily. You are the CEO." Charlotte laughed. "That obvious?" Lily nodded. You look like one. Even Ethan laughed at that. The ice broke instantly. A few minutes later, they gathered around the workbench where the documents had been carefully arranged. Charlotte began examining them one by one. Her expression gradually changed. Curiosity became concentration. Concentration became astonishment. Several pages later, she looked up. These are real. Ethan nodded. That seems to be the consensus. Charlotte returned to reading. Another hour passed. Then another. By late afternoon, stacks of notes surrounded her. Every new document revealed additional connections to modern manufacturing methods. Several concepts could dramatically improve technologies currently under development at Greencore Innovations. Charlotte finally leaned back and exhaled slowly. I understand now. Ethan waited. Understand what? She looked directly at him. Why people keep calling me. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. Inside, the workshop felt unusually quiet. Charlotte studied the documents again. Then she asked a question nobody else had considered. Do you know what you actually have? Ethan smiled faintly. An important piece of history. Charlotte shook her head. More than that. She tapped one specific folder. These ideas were never commercialized. Another document. These designs were never patented. Another. And these concepts solve problems companies still spend millions trying to overcome. Ethan remained calm. Charlotte found that remarkable. Most people would have become excited the moment they heard the word millions. Ethan seemed more interested in preserving the material properly. What would you do? He asked. Charlotte looked around the workshop, then at Lily, then back at the documents. I would protect it. Her answer came without hesitation. And after that, Charlotte smiled slowly. I would make sure the right people understood its value. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Lily looked between them. That sounds important. Charlotte laughed softly. It is. What neither Ethan nor Lily fully realized at that moment was that Greencore's board of directors was already reviewing preliminary valuations. Legal teams were analyzing intellectual property implications. Industry experts were preparing reports. And hidden inside those forgotten papers was something capable of changing far more than a few engineering projects. The discovery everyone once called trash was rapidly becoming one of the most valuable opportunities Charlotte Bennett had ever encountered. 3 days after Charlotte Bennett visited the workshop, the pace of events accelerated dramatically. What had begun as a forgotten crate purchased at a small-town market was now attracting attention from lawyers, historians, investors, and corporate executives across the country. Yet inside Ethan Carter's workshop, life remained remarkably normal. Engines still needed repairs. Customers still needed help. Bills still needed to be paid. Lily still needed rides to school and help with homework. Ethan preferred it that way. On a quiet Wednesday morning, he was replacing brake pads on a delivery van when his phone rang again. The caller identification displayed Charlotte's name. Ethan wiped his hands on a shop towel and answered. Good morning. Charlotte sounded excited. Do you have a few minutes? I can make a few. He heard papers moving on her end. Then a brief laugh. I have spent my entire career waiting for a conversation like this. Ethan smiled. That sounds serious. It is. Charlotte paused. Our valuation team completed their preliminary review. Ethan leaned against the workbench. And silence lingered for a moment. Then Charlotte answered carefully. The numbers are much higher than we expected. Ethan remained calm. Charlotte had begun noticing that about him. Most people reacted emotionally whenever money entered a conversation. Ethan rarely did. How much higher? He asked. Enough that our board called an emergency meeting. Across the workshop, Lily looked up from organizing inventory. She immediately knew something important was happening. Ethan listened quietly while Charlotte explained the findings. Several undocumented concepts contained inside the archive had direct applications to modern sustainable manufacturing. Some could reduce production costs. Others improved efficiency. A few solved technical problems that companies had struggled with for years. The historical value alone was significant. The commercial value appeared extraordinary. After the call ended, Ethan sat quietly for several minutes. Not because he was overwhelmed, because he was thinking. Lily eventually walked over. Big news. Ethan nodded. Maybe. Lily laughed. You always say maybe when the answer is definitely yes. Ethan smiled. That is probably true. Later that week, Charlotte arrived again. This time she brought 2 members of Greencore's executive team and a senior intellectual property attorney. The atmosphere felt professional but respectful. Nobody treated Ethan like a small-town scavenger. Nobody dismissed the workshop. Those attitudes had disappeared completely. Everyone entering the building now understood they were standing inside the place where one of the most remarkable discoveries in recent industry history had surfaced. The meeting lasted several hours. Documents covered the main workbench. Reports were reviewed. Historical evidence was examined. Questions were answered. By late afternoon, the attorney finally closed a folder and leaned back. Everything appears legitimate. One executive nodded. More than legitimate. Another looked toward Ethan. Honestly, this is extraordinary. Ethan simply thanked them and continued listening. Charlotte noticed something that impressed her more with every visit. Ethan never tried to dominate conversations. He never demanded attention. He never reminded people that he had been right. He simply focused on facts, on value, on doing things correctly. As the meeting continued, one executive asked a question. "Can I be honest?" Ethan smiled. "Of course." The man glanced around the workshop. When Charlotte first told us where these documents were found, nobody believed it. A few people laughed. "Neither did I," another admitted. Charlotte smiled. "That makes all of us." Ethan shrugged lightly. People usually do not expect important things to come from ordinary places. The room fell quiet, because everyone suddenly realized how true that statement was. 2 days later, Greencore's board of directors held a special session. Charlotte presented her final recommendation. Large screens displayed research findings, historical analysis, market projections, potential applications, future opportunities. By the end of the presentation, nobody questioned the significance of the discovery. The only remaining question was what happened next. Charlotte stood before the board and made her proposal. The room listened carefully. Several members exchanged surprised looks. Others reviewed figures again. Then one director smiled. "You are serious?" Charlotte nodded. "Completely." Another director looked at the numbers. "That is a very large offer." Charlotte folded her hands confidently. "So is the opportunity." The vote passed unanimously. Back in the small town, Ethan spent Friday afternoon exactly where he usually spent Friday afternoons. At the market, beside folding tables filled with old tools, mechanical parts, and forgotten equipment. Customers wandered past. Vendors chatted casually. Life seemed ordinary. Then a luxury vehicle quietly pulled into the parking lot. People noticed immediately. Several vendors stopped talking. Curious eyes followed the vehicle as Charlotte stepped out and walked toward Ethan's booth. The same man who once laughed at Ethan's collection of junk stood only 20 feet away. Charlotte smiled warmly. "Good afternoon." Ethan smiled back. "Good afternoon." The market seemed to grow strangely quiet. Charlotte held a slim folder in her hands. Inside was a proposal approved by an entire corporate board. A proposal worth more money than anyone standing in that market could imagine. And as dozens of curious eyes watched from nearby booths, Charlotte prepared to make an offer that would leave an entire crowd speechless. The market seemed to pause as Charlotte Bennett stood beside Ethan Carter's folding table, holding a slim leather folder. Conversations softened. Vendors glanced toward one another. Curious shoppers slowed their pace. Even the musicians near the food stall seemed quieter than before. Something important was happening. People could feel it. Ethan remained calm. The same calm he carried while sorting through boxes of discarded tools or helping customers load used equipment into their trucks. Charlotte appreciated that about him. The attention surrounding this moment would have overwhelmed many people. Ethan seemed completely unaffected. Lily stood nearby watching with wide eyes. She knew enough to understand that the folder in Charlotte's hands mattered. She just did not know how much. Charlotte opened the folder carefully. "I wanted to do this here." Ethan looked surprised. "At the market?" Charlotte smiled. This is where the story started. Several nearby vendors moved closer. Nobody wanted to appear obvious, but curiosity was winning. Charlotte removed a document and handed it to Ethan. Our board completed its review. Ethan glanced down. Detailed numbers filled multiple pages. Legal language, valuation reports, licensing structures, development agreements. It took him a moment to process what he was seeing. Then he looked up. "This is substantial." Charlotte laughed softly. That is one way to describe it. The crowd around them continued growing. The same vendor who once joked about recycling centers stood only a few feet away pretending to organize inventory. The man who repeatedly laughed at Ethan's collection of junk watched openly now. Nobody seemed interested in hiding their curiosity anymore. Charlotte folded her hands. Green Corps would like exclusive rights to develop the technologies represented in the archive. Ethan nodded slowly. I understand. We would also like your continued involvement as a consultant. Several people exchanged confused looks. Consultant? Ethan? Charlotte continued. The initial agreement includes a payment of $1 million. Silence. Complete silence. The market that normally echoed with conversations, negotiations, and laughter suddenly felt still. A nearby vendor dropped a roll of tape. Nobody even looked at it. The man who mocked Ethan blinked several times. Another vendor quietly lowered a coffee cup halfway to his mouth and forgot to drink. Lily looked at her father, then at Charlotte, then back at her father. Did she say 1 million? Ethan smiled. I believe she did. Charlotte laughed. Yes, I did. The silence deepened. Because only days earlier many of these same people laughed when Ethan purchased the crate. They called it garbage. They called it junk. They asked who would ever pay money for trash. Now one of the most successful CEOs in the country was standing in front of everyone offering $1 million agreement based on something discovered inside that very crate. Yet what happened next surprised Charlotte more than anything else. Ethan did not celebrate. He did not shout. He did not pump his fist into the air. He did not demand apologies from anyone. Instead, he carefully reviewed the documents again. Then he asked questions. Thoughtful questions. Practical questions. Questions about preserving historical materials. Questions about educational access. Questions about long-term stewardship. Charlotte smiled as she answered. This was exactly why she respected him. He cared more about responsibility than recognition. Nearly 40 minutes passed before the conversation ended. The agreement was real. The valuation was real. The opportunity was real. Finally, Charlotte extended her hand. What do you think? Ethan looked around the market. He saw the booths, the folding tables, the people who came every weekend. He saw Lily standing proudly beside him. Then he looked at Charlotte. I think we have a deal. Charlotte shook his hand. Applause erupted almost immediately. It started from one vendor, then another, then dozens more joined in. People smiled. Some cheered. Others simply nodded with genuine respect. Even the man who laughed the loudest stepped forward awkwardly. Ethan. Ethan turned toward him. The man looked uncomfortable. I owe you an apology. Ethan smiled gently. You do not owe me anything. No. The man shook his head. I do. Several people listened quietly. I thought you were wasting your time. Ethan remained silent. Looks like I was wrong. Ethan nodded politely. It happens. The simplicity of the response somehow carried more grace than any speech could have. No humiliation. No revenge. No bitterness. Just dignity. Later that afternoon, after Charlotte departed and the crowd slowly returned to normal, Ethan sat beside Lily under the shade of a small tree near the edge of the market. The agreement rested safely inside a folder beside them. Lily looked at him carefully. You know what is funny? Ethan smiled. What? Everyone thinks the money is the amazing part. Ethan laughed softly. And what do you think? Lily looked toward the old crate still sitting in the back of the pickup truck. I think the amazing part is that you saw something nobody else saw. Ethan sat quietly for a moment. Then he smiled. Because out of everyone there that day, his daughter understood the story better than anyone else. The agreement changed many things, but it did not change Ethan Carter. Monday morning arrived exactly as it always did. The sun rose over the fields surrounding the property. Birds settled along the fence line. The workshop doors opened shortly after breakfast. Customers arrived with repair requests. Engines still needed attention. Equipment still needed maintenance. Life continued. That simple truth surprised many people. News of the agreement spread quickly through the region. Local newspapers published articles. Industry websites discussed the discovery. Several television stations requested interviews. Ethan declined most of them. He was grateful for the opportunity that had arrived, but he never wanted attention to become the center of the story. For him, the discovery mattered because of what it represented. Patience, curiosity, respect for things others overlooked. One afternoon, Charlotte Bennett visited again. This time she arrived without lawyers, executives, or advisors. She simply wanted to talk. Ethan was repairing an old hydraulic pump when she entered the workshop. You are still doing this? She asked with a smile. Ethan looked up. Doing what? Working. Ethan laughed. I have always worked. Charlotte shook her head. Most people would take a vacation. Most people are probably smarter than me. They both laughed. Lily walked in carrying a tray with 3 glasses of iced tea. Dad says that every time somebody compliments him. Charlotte accepted a glass. That sounds accurate. They sat near the large workbench where the discovery had first been examined. For a while they simply talked. Not about contracts. Not about valuations. Not about business. They talked about life. Family. Challenges. Lessons learned. Charlotte eventually looked around the workshop. You know something? Ethan raised an eyebrow. What? When I first heard your story, I thought the documents were the valuable part. Ethan smiled. And now? Charlotte glanced toward shelves filled with old tools and repaired equipment. Now I think I was wrong. Ethan waited. The valuable part was the person who recognized their value. For a moment neither spoke. The words settled quietly between them. Across the country, Green Corps' development teams had already begun working with the recovered research. Engineers praised the quality of the ideas. Historians celebrated the preservation of lost industrial knowledge. Investors applauded the opportunity. Yet within the company, another conversation had started appearing repeatedly. People wanted to know more about Ethan. Not because he became wealthy, because his story challenged assumptions. One executive later admitted, "We almost dismissed the discovery because of where it came from." That statement spread throughout Green Corps. It became a lesson. Talent does not always arrive wearing an expensive suit. Wisdom does not always come with prestigious titles. Sometimes it arrives in a pickup truck carrying boxes other people call junk. Several weeks later, Charlotte invited Ethan and Lily to visit Green Corps headquarters. The building towered above downtown Seattle, surrounded by glass and steel. Employees filled expansive offices. Advanced laboratories occupied entire floors. For Lily, the experience felt like stepping into another world. Yet what happened inside impressed her even more. As Ethan entered the main conference hall, hundreds of employees stood and applauded. The sound filled the room. Not because he was famous, not because he was wealthy, because they respected what he represented. Ethan looked genuinely uncomfortable with the attention. Charlotte smiled. You will survive. Lily laughed. Probably. During the presentation that followed, Charlotte spoke briefly about innovation. Then she spoke about character. She described perseverance, humility, curiosity, integrity. Finally, she pointed toward Ethan. The world often rewards results, she said. But results usually begin with people willing to see value where others see none. The room applauded again. Ethan simply nodded politely. Later that evening, father and daughter stood outside their hotel overlooking the city skyline. Lights stretched across the horizon. Cars moved far below like streams of light. Lily leaned against the railing. Everything feels different. Ethan considered that. Does it? A little. He smiled. Some things changed. Like what? Ethan looked toward the distant lights. Opportunities. Lily nodded. Then she asked the question that had been sitting in her mind for days. Are you glad they laughed? Ethan looked surprised. Why would you ask that? Because if nobody laughed, maybe none of this happens. Ethan thought about it carefully. The market, the crate, the discovery, the agreement. Charlotte. Every step that followed. Finally he smiled. I am glad I did not listen to them. Lily smiled back. And somewhere deep inside, both understood a truth far more valuable than any contract. The world had not changed because someone found treasure. The world had changed because one person refused to judge value by appearance. And that lesson was continuing to inspire people far beyond a small-town market where laughter once filled the air. Autumn arrived quietly that year. The trees surrounding Ethan Carter's property shifted from deep green to gold and amber. Cool morning air drifted across the fields. The workshop remained busy, but life had settled into a new rhythm. The agreement with Green Corps had brought financial security. The historical archive was being preserved properly. The research was helping shape future innovations. Yet the most meaningful changes could not be measured on any balance sheet. They appeared in small moments, the kind that rarely make headlines. One Saturday morning, Ethan and Lily returned to the market, not because they needed to, because they wanted to. The same folding tables stood beneath the open sky. The same vendors greeted customers. The same familiar faces moved between rows of booths. Yet something felt different. Months earlier, people walked past Ethan's table laughing. Now they stopped to shake his hand. They asked questions. They listened. More importantly, they showed respect. Ethan never demanded it. He never chased it. Somehow that made it more meaningful when it arrived. As he arranged several restored tools on a display table, Frank approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Look at this place," Frank said. Ethan smiled. "Looks the same to me." Frank laughed. "No, it does not." He handed Ethan a cup. "People see you differently now." Ethan looked around the market. Then he shook his head gently. "I hope not." Frank studied him carefully. "Why?" Ethan glanced toward Lily, who was helping a younger vendor organize merchandise. "Because I am the same person I was before." Frank smiled. "Exactly." Nearby, the man who once laughed the loudest approached slowly. Months earlier, embarrassment filled every conversation he attempted with Ethan. Over time, something changed. The embarrassment became humility. "Morning, Ethan." "Morning." The man hesitated before speaking again. "My son started collecting old equipment." Ethan smiled. "Really? Says there might be hidden value in things people overlook." Ethan laughed softly. "Sounds like a smart kid." The man nodded. "He learned from your story." After he walked away, Ethan stood quietly for a moment. That simple conversation meant more than any public recognition, because true change rarely happened through arguments. It happened through example. Later that afternoon, Charlotte Bennett arrived unexpectedly. She was in town for another meeting and decided to stop by. No executives followed her. No cameras accompanied her. She simply walked through the market like any other visitor. Lily spotted her first. "Charlotte." Charlotte smiled. "Good to see you." They spent the afternoon talking beneath a clear blue sky. At one point, Charlotte looked toward the old wooden crate, now preserved inside a protective display case near Ethan's booth. "Funny." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What?" Charlotte pointed toward it. "The thing everyone called trash." Ethan smiled. "I remember." Charlotte shook her head. "No, that is not the funny part." "What is?" She looked around the market. Families laughed together. Vendors greeted customers. Children carried bags of kettle corn through the rows of booths. The atmosphere felt warm and peaceful. The funny part is that the crate was never the treasure. Ethan understood immediately. So did Lily. The treasure was never hidden inside the box. It was hidden inside the way Ethan viewed the world. His patience, his integrity, his refusal to judge worth by appearances. As sunset approached, golden light spread across the market. Long shadows stretched across the pavement. The familiar sounds of the afternoon slowly softened. Ethan stood beside Lily watching the sky change colors. "Dad." "Yes." "Do you ever wish things happened differently?" Ethan considered the question. The laughter, the doubts, the long years of being underestimated, the struggles, the uncertainty, every step that eventually led to this moment. Finally, he smiled. "No." Lily looked surprised. "Not even a little?" Ethan shook his head. "Because if life had been easier, I might never have learned what really matters." Lily slipped her hand into his. Neither spoke for a while. They simply watched the sunset together. Peaceful, grateful, whole. And perhaps that was the greatest reward of all. Not the money, not the recognition, not the headlines. It was the quiet knowledge that character matters, that kindness matters, that dignity matters. Sometimes the world notices quickly. Sometimes it takes years. But eventually, value has a way of revealing itself. Just like that forgotten crate sitting beneath a layer of dust. The market lights flickered on as evening settled across the town. Conversations drifted through the cooling air. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed. This time, it sounded different. Warm, genuine, respectful. And if this story reminded you that worth cannot always be seen at first glance, share your thoughts below. Tell us about a time someone surprised you by proving the world wrong. And if stories about dignity, second chances, and quiet strength speak to your heart, we would be honored to have you join us again for another journey.